Good morning or good afternoon, I suppose it is for many of you. Um, it's my pleasure to be here. And before we start, what I want to do is I just want to ask you a quick question. So if you can put into your chat, if you think about the last few retrospectives that you've participated, okay? Improving test automation coverage, test automation, not enough time. Okay, so what I want to point out, if you look in the chat, that except for Maru, who wrote down here communication, disagreements on decisions, tactics to deal with external pressure, visions and goals, most of what is discussed in your retrospectives has to do with your task, right? So you're really not focusing on the team in your retrospectives. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. And we asked another group, we gave them this question: what are some of the common challenges or dysfunctions that you run into with your teams? And this is the typical issues that the teams face: communication, conflict, team dynamics, commitment, groupthink, trust. So if you look at this, you'll see that the challenges that are faced by the team are different than what the team is typically talking about in their retrospectives. So I'm Dr. Wolff, and I've been studying teams for a long time now, probably almost 30 years. And I started studying team emotional intelligence, which was published in Harvard Business Review a long time ago. And I now have moved that to something that I call inspired teams, which is what we'll be talking about today. And the comparative agility platform has a version of the inspired teams survey that you have access to. So what I'm going to cover today is there's three mindset shifts that need to happen in order to really use your retrospective to create an inspired team. Within each of these mindset shifts, we'll talk a little bit about the principles for creating an inspired team, some tools for operating with a new mindset, and some of the implications for your retrospectives. So you might be wondering, what do I mean by an inspired retrospective? And basically, this isn't, if you have an image that, we're going to create a fun, exciting retrospective with games and stuff, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is your team knows where to pay attention to create what I call an inspired team, and I'll define that in a second. That the team has an energizing and meaningful discussion that builds your culture. And it's really the discussion that talks about the values that you're operating with. That's really the important thing that helps you really build the team. And when you're having that discussion, it actually is quite energizing, and people get very involved. And so what is an inspired team? And let me ask you, they're mowing the lawn outside. I've put my Zoom on high filtering. Are you hearing the lawnmowers? No, okay, good. So So good. So the Zoom filter works. So what's an inspired team? So an inspired team is a team that thrives in a complex and fast-paced environment, emotionally committed to each other's support, and achieving a shared vision with high performance, breakthrough performance. And what happens is when you're operating as an inspired team, it's a joyful place to work. Now, I can tell you that, at least in my experience over my life, there have been only one or two teams where I've actually really experienced this. And I just remember one team, we were working on something, we lost all track of time. It was like I looked at my watch, it was 3 o'clock in the morning because we're just so involved in what we were doing. There's passion, people are excited to try new things. Everybody's really responsible for the success of each other in the team. So that's what I mean by creating an inspired team. And by the way, all the task things that you talk about in your retrospectives typically, they're certainly important to resolve. But what I find is a lot of things that are problematic start with the culture of the team. And when you fix the culture of the team, you solve a lot of issues without even focusing on them. I know it sounds pretty magical, but it really does happen that way. And I'll show you a little bit later on some of how that happens, or some of what happens. So let's get into some of the mindset shifts that are needed to create an inspired team. So the first mindset shift, and this is really probably the hardest one, is that you need to shift from when there's an issue, when there's a problem, thinking that you are the problem. We tend to focus on individuals to thinking the team is a problem. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because this is hard for people to really understand and get their head around. And even when you think you do, you probably don't. And I find myself having to often take a step back, take a breath, and remember that I need to focus on the team. So, for example, you know, we're working on this book chapter, and we'd have a meeting and somebody wouldn't show up. I'd get really upset, right? And I'd want to lash out, and not literally lash out, and I'd want to, you know, call them out on it. Look, if we're going to have a meeting, you have to be there. And then I had stepped back and I said, well, maybe there's something going on in their life. Maybe there's really a good reason. And I allowed myself to try to understand what was going on for them the next time we talked. And it turned out the person had COVID. So, you know, that's just an example of how you need to sort of step back and think about the values. And in that case, the value was we try to understand each other before we blame each other. But it's really not easy, especially when you're at a meeting, somebody doesn't show up and you're upset. So as I said, when you're making this shift, there's a psychological phenomenon, which you'll see down at the bottom in quotes there, called the fundamental attribution error. And that is such a common thing that there's a psychological name for it. And it's the phenomenon is we focus on individuals. So when you see a behavior, the behavior is a function of the person for sure, and the context and the environment that they're in. But we tend to overlook the environment. And so, a group is a bunch of individuals. And so we see people as individuals. It's very hard to see the systemic nature of a team. And so we overestimate the importance of the personality over the context. And so just to give you an idea, you experience the importance of the context in your everyday life. So if you think about when you're at church, you behave in a certain way. You don't behave that way in all situations. So if you go to a ball game, your behavior is very different than when you're at church. The context, the situation changes your behavior. And there's a very famous experiment that was done in 1951, like 70 years ago. And some of you may have already seen this, but it was one of the first experiments that kind of really illustrated how important the context is to people's behaviors and decisions. And it was done by Solomon Asch in 1951. And essentially, what they did was they put people in a room with a set of other people, but those other people were really compatriots of the researcher. They were not just everyday people. And they asked people, take a look at the line on the left, and which line, A, B, or C, matches the length of that line. Now that looks pretty obvious probably to you. But what happened was they told the people who were working for the researcher to choose either line A or line B, not line C. And so let's say they were told to choose line B, and the researcher would go around the room and would ask the first person, which line? And they'd say B. And they'd ask the second person, and they'd say B. And then they'd get to the test subject, and they'd ask them. And what they found was a large percentage of them, not all of them, about 20 some odd percent, but 70 some odd percent went along with the group. The context of the environment where everybody is saying B made the person choose B. So, what's the practical implication of this? It's when you see certain behavior in your team, the first thing that you need to do is ask, what's the context the team has created that can draw out this behavior? And if you see this picture on the right, why did I put this picture on the right there? Because what you see is a bunch of iron filings, and obviously we know what causes this shape, right? There's a magnet underneath. But suppose you didn't know that. Suppose this system that you see, all you notice is the shavings on the top, and you want to change that pattern. You'd have a hard time understanding it unless you understood the system that was generating that pattern. And as I said before, the context, the culture that you create in your team is drawing out the patterns of behavior you see. And so you need to ask the question, what is the context we're creating? And you, when your culture is not creating a context that's creating an inspired team, you feel it, you know it. You're upset, you're frustrated, you feel guarded, like you can't say exactly what you want, right? And so when people are feeling something, the thing to do is ask, well, what is this information? What is this emotional energy telling us about the team? Now, I want to ask you another question here. So this is some advice, some practical advice when you understand that the context of your team has a lot to do with the behavior in your team. How helpful is this information? So just put into chat for me. Is this like really helpful information? Not helpful at all? Somewhat helpful? Extremely helpful? What do you think this information is for you? Very helpful, somewhat helpful, really helpful, a bit general advice, somewhat helpful, okay, helpful, needs more, okay, good. I'll stop it there because that's precisely the point I want to make. We get a lot of advice, and when I was a doctoral student, it drove me totally freaking up a wall. I'd be reading articles and reading stuff, and I'd be getting advice like this. It's you can't really operate with this piece of advice. It's good to keep in mind, and it's good to set the stage, but this doesn't really help you figure out what to do. And if you look at Agile Principle number 12, which has to do with your retrospectives, you'll see it really has the same problem. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, and then it tunes and adjusts. That's really, really, really good. But let me ask you a question. So if I told you that there's a treasure waiting for you, and the key to getting that treasure is you need to do the following three things. You need to go to why not and pick up clue 1. Then you need to go to why and pick up clue 2. And finally, you need to pick up the last clue at ZZYZX. And by the way, these are, believe it or not, real town names in the United States. So once again, in chat, if I told you that your treasure required you to do these three things, what would be the first thing that you would do? What would you do? Because you certainly couldn't follow these instructions, could you? What is the treasure? Yeah, it's a lot of money. Let's call it that. It's something you really want. Google Maps, locate these on a map. Okay. Research. You'd have to figure out where these are. Go to why not. Yes, but you need a map to get there, right? What direction? Okay, absolutely. That's exactly the point. You need a map. What I just provided you and those principles really are the same as these clues, right? They're not quite sufficient enough. You need a map. And by the way, here is the Google map of these towns. You can see why not is in Mississippi. Y is in Arizona, and believe it or not, there is a ZZYZX in California. So yes, you get out your map and you figure out where these things are. This concept is why you, in my mind, why in your retrospectives, although you're supposed to be talking about the team and the team dynamic, you wind up talking about the task because you don't have a map. You don't know what it is that you need to talk about with respect to the team, other than your frustrations and things that are obviously going wrong. And I'm going to show you in a little bit as well why it's so hard to understand where to go if I don't give you the map. And so the first principle, don't fly blind. You need to know where to focus your attention. The Inspired Teams framework, which, as I said, you can have access to on the Comparative Agility website, is a map of the framework. It's a map, it's a set of values, and I'll show it to you quickly. It's a set of values that over my 30 years of research has been shown to create the type of team that I defined as an inspired team. And so essentially, it shows you the key leverage points for culture change. That's what it does. And so this is a little bit different diagram of it than you'll see on the Comparative Agility website. But this is just another picture of it. And what you'll see here is there are a set of values, and you can see those in the bullet points. Don't worry about what they are. If you go to the website and you look at the for the survey, you will see what the framework provides for you. But these are a set of values, so you need to have a purpose, and it needs to be front and center. For example, there needs to be understanding. So people need to try to understand each other. And I illustrated that in my story at the beginning, right? Somebody didn't show up to a meeting. The first thing is you get upset and you want to lash out. But the value of understanding says, no, look, we need to understand what's going on. And you can imagine the difference in your team if somebody has COVID and you start lashing out at them and saying, look, if we have a meeting, you have to be here, you can't be, and versus, oh, so, you weren't there, is everything okay? I hope everything's all right. Is there a problem? Think about the difference in the energy created by the different context that operating with understanding creates. So I'm not going to go through all of these because you can access them on the website, and the names will be a little different. But I want to point out to you the emotions at the top and the bottom. Because if you remember, principle number 2 said, if you sense that something is off, that you're not operating with one of the values, and the guy's now out here with a leaf blower, so hopefully Zoom's filter is still working. But if you're not operating with one of these values, you feel it, you know it. You know when you're passionate about the work of the team or when you're disengaged. You know when you're excited because you're creating new things or when you're afraid to make a mistake. Those are the emotional cues that you can use to help you understand what's going on in your team. And I'll talk about that in a little while. So what's the implications for your retrospectives? The implication is you need to first have a discussion and come to an agreement on the team's values. You don't want to fly blind. You don't want to let things happen by chance. Nothing good happens when people just act. Values will form, norms will form, but they won't be the ones that you want, and they won't be the ones that create this inspired culture. So I showed you the framework. You can use it as a guide. It's a guide. It's not intended to be, the be all end all. It's a map. There's different routes you can take to get to your destination, being an inspired team. But you need to be a little careful, because things that are common issues in your teams don't necessarily have obvious genesis. The source of them is not always obvious. So let me show you. I showed you that word cloud. And the word cloud had a lot of things that were problems around the teams. And here are those same things, but they're listed in those 4 pillars of the culture. So when there's conflict or dysfunctional members, and you're trying to point to the member, okay, or you're trying to build conflict resolution skills because you think people don't know how to talk to each other, or you've got quiet members and you point them out and you say, look, you need to speak up. We really need your input. That's focusing on the individual. These things, and I'll just mention the energy one, but the rest of them are similar, are often addressed by focusing on the values in the energy sector. So let me give you an example. It's one of my favorite stories. A dysfunctional member, like there was a team where this member was creating disruption every time the leader would speak. They'd get up and walk out, they'd scratch their knee vigorously. And eventually they called this person out and they were spoken to, and the manager spoke to them and says, look, this is really disruptive to the team. Can you please stop doing this? And the person said, sure, not a problem, I'll stop. And the behavior stopped for a week or so, but then it would come back. And it might come back a little bit different type of disruptive behavior. And so they called us in, and the team, by the way, was working quite well. It wasn't like this was a really dysfunctional team. They just felt they could be doing better, and they called us in, and at that point we were working with team emotional intelligence. And by the way, Inspired Teams is a combination of team emotional intelligence, and then I've infused some agile thinking and principles into that framework. So it's a combination of, agile and team emotional intelligence. But we worked with them around team emotional intelligence, and what we found was their understanding. They weren't operating with understanding very strongly. And so this person had a concern, and then every time they tried to raise it up to the team, they would be squashed and they couldn't get their concern heard. And this was an unconscious thing because the team was working well. They didn't want to break what they had. And so they were afraid to deal with that concern and that conflict. Once they realized that, and they saw that they were squashing this concern, which they had no intention of doing, they were able to hear it. They were able to improve their value of understanding and their norms around understanding. They heard this person, that person's behavior disappeared almost instantly. it was just magical. And I don't use that word lightly. I'm an engineer and a scientist, and that word is not a word that I use, but I have come to not be able to explain these phenomenon in any other way. It's like trying to change those iron filings, the patterns of the iron filings, and just not knowing that there's a magnet. And all of a sudden, you realize the magnet, and it just makes things so much easier, right? It's the same here. And so by focusing on understanding, the dysfunction went away. And it was the same. I have other stories for around a lot of these, but it was the same for conflict in another team. I won't go into it. I want to get to the rest of this stuff. But the point is, when you make a set of values, if you choose not to at least pay attention to the ones in the framework, you really need to be careful, because those ones in the framework are known to have these magical properties. So mindset shift number 2, that taking care of the team and the culture is the leader's job. And that needs to shift to it's everybody's job. Typically, we think of it as the leaders in charge of building the team. But think about this, your context is built in every interaction. Every interaction helps to build or destroy the values that your team is operating with, and helps to build or destroy the norms that guide behavior. The leader can initiate a discussion, and I'll show you that. And the leader can influence values, but it's really everyone who needs to hold those values and be responsible for them, not just the leader. So in your retrospective, what you can do, and certainly as a leader or even as a team member, but certainly you're in a better place as a leader, is you can start a discussion around your values and create agreement on how do you want to operate. And here are some questions to start a discussion. Which one you pick, you can just choose one. I would start from the top and go down, because they are actually arranged in an order that helps to build safety in the group in more and more, I want to say difficult, but higher levels of safety, if you want to call it that. So you can just choose one if you want. You can start from the top and go down. Or you can also take the Inspired Team Survey on the Comparative Agility website, and you can see where your team is scoring high and where it's scoring low, and pick the ones that you're scoring lowest on. I would caution you even there, because if you think about it, some of these, like for example, if you look in transparency, how do we provide feedback? That's a little harder to do until you've created understanding and caring, which are in the energy, right? It's hard to accept feedback from people you don't think care about you. So even if you score low there, which a lot of teams do, you need to consider, is that the first place we want to start, or do we want to build up to the point where we can have that discussion more effectively, right? And I encourage you to create your own values and create your own questions. These are, not necessarily, exactly how you want to word the question in your in your retrospective, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing you want to talk about. So now I want to get on to mindset shift number 3. And this is the way I think about it. But we watered it 2 weeks ago, and you've got the picture on the right, your flower, your team is thriving, you watered it, you did your retrospective. It's 2 weeks later, and you have this wilted plant, but we watered it 2 weeks ago. Well, your team is the same as this plant. Your team needs care constantly. As I said, every interaction serves to build or destroy your culture and the values by which you're operating. And if something happens that goes against the values and nobody tends to that situation, but you wait 2 weeks, it festers. And not only that, but it becomes the norm. It becomes the way you operate. So I'm sure you've all been in teams where meetings just never, ever start on time. Why? Why does that happen? It happens because somebody came in late and everybody just waited until everybody was there. And it became the norm. Oh, it's okay to come in late. Nobody said anything. It's fine to come in late if everybody agrees that that's what you want to do. But if it's really not okay for most of the people, then you need to talk about it. And when you talk about it, you'll find out, yeah, no, we don't care if people show up late. We like talking at the beginning. It's okay if people want to be 10 minutes, fine, we'll wait. We'll just enjoy not a problem for your team, but it may be a problem. And so the key is talking about it and agreeing. So shifting from taking care of your team once every 2 weeks or however often you do your retrospectives to doing it continuously. As I said, every interaction affects your culture. And the way I think about it is it's sort of like a piece of mold, right? You see a piece of mold on a wall in your room, and you have a few choices. You can just say, it's just a little tiny speck. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go on vacation. I'll be back. Maybe I'll take care of it then. And this is what you come back to, right? It grows, it festers. This is what happens to your team when the values that you agree to do not get taken care of on an interaction by interaction daily basis. And you might be saying, oh my God, I'm going to be spending all my time taking care of the team. No. That's not what happens. Okay. It happens in very, very short observations that I'm going to show you in a second. So the principle here is you need to be intentional. You need to know the values you want and live them in every interaction. And when you notice something, when that mold starts to grow and you notice it because you feel something, you feel upset, you feel angry. And this is where you need to step back and say, okay, it's the context. What are we doing? How am I contributing? Right? When you start to notice something, that's the time when you need to say to yourself, okay, what is going on here? What's the emotion telling me? Which of the values are being violated here? And what do I need to say? And it happens in small steps. It happens in what you say in the instant. So when your meeting doesn't start on time, it's a simple, oh, I notice, we're not starting on time. Is that okay? I mean, that takes like 5 seconds. And let me give you an example of this. There was an Agile team where somebody was coming in late. Jose was coming in late. And they had a scrum master, and the scrum master wasn't acknowledging this, and it just happened and just kept happening. They got a new scrum master, and that scrum master made an observation. They saw the first time this happened, didn't say anything. The second time it happened, they said, I noticed Jose's coming in late, and nobody's asking why. What's up with that? And Jose then spoke up. This is a real incident. Jose then spoke up and said, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed. I didn't want to trouble the team with my problems, but I have to bring my kid to school, and at 9:45, and if there's traffic, I can't make the meeting at 9:00, and I just didn't want to burden the team." At which point the team could say, "Oh, that's not a problem. We can move the meeting to 9:30. Now, I want you to notice the difference in energy that one, 5-second observation made, that tending to the value or tending to the agreed to norm, that 5-second observation. Think about the energy in the team when everybody's thinking Jose doesn't care, because we all make judgments, right? When we don't check in, we're making up stories. Jose doesn't care. He's coming in late. He's terrible team member, and nobody's saying anything, right? Jose's feeling embarrassed. He's feeling, under pressure. The team's feeling upset. And then you make that observation. Now, Jose is feeling energized. It's like, oh, my team cares about me. I can now be in the meeting. That sense of energy, I hope you can feel the difference that 5-second observation makes. So you need to translate that emotion that you're feeling into an observation. So again, I'm going to ask you, is that useful advice? And I won't make you put into chat, because the answer is the same as before. No, because you don't have the practical way to do that. Like, what exactly should I do and say? How should I do this? And unfortunately, we don't have time for me to go over this with you, but I'm going to just briefly explain this to you. So there's something that I call, named after the incident that I just explained to you. Hey team, what's up with that? And it starts with that sense that you're experiencing, right? So if you remember that framework I showed you, the emotions across the top or the bottom, when you're feeling one of those, it gives you a clue. Oh, maybe it's something in this energy. And you can start to think, is it understanding? Are we supporting each other? Do we have a purpose, right? Then you share that sense with your team, and you share it you have to be really careful in crafting this. And like I say, I don't have time to explain all this, but you craft it in a way that it's just your observation. It's not making a judgment. It's stating a fact. People are coming in late to the team. Nobody's saying anything. You don't want to say Jose doesn't care about the team because he's coming in late, right? That's judgmental. It's going to provoke a response, right? So just state the facts. And then the what's up with that part of it is, it's an invitation to a discussion. What do we want to do? Do we care if people are late? You may not, like I said. Let's agree. How do we want to operate? That's the basic format here. And when you do not provide that sense to the team and share that sense, it's a betrayal of the team, because you have information that the team needs to function really well, but you haven't provided it. But here's the thing, it's not easy. So don't get, hard on yourself, because it really isn't easy. But at least do this. Observe when your teammate is able to do it and say thank you, because you know how hard it is. Okay. You recognized there was something that you wanted to share at one point in time, but you didn't. And now that your teammate is, you want to encourage that. And so you thank them for it. So just the anatomy, as I said, it's an attention getter. Hey team, I notice whatever the observation is, the fact we don't show up to our meetings on time, and then the invitation to the discussion. And you can make this a thing, a fun thing in your team, okay? You can change the language if that doesn't suit you, but the point is, make the observation whatever way is comfortable to you. But if you can make it fun and make it a thing in your team, it's more likely people will actually do it. So some examples: hey team, I noticed we didn't show appreciation for one another, or we don't show what's up with that. Hey team, I feel great. We just celebrated a failure that we learned from. And by the way, it's not just what's going wrong. It's also very powerful to notice what's going right and reinforce it. Execution, I notice we aren't keeping promises to one another. What's up with that? And that, by the way, is one that's incorporated from Agile, right? So, it's having your definitions of done, so you know what it promise is, et cetera. And transparency, I feel great. We just had a substantive discussion raising issues that were difficult. Way to go. Do you feel the same way? So again, reinforcing. So the implications for your retrospectives is make Hey Team a thing, or however you want to do it that's comfortable for you, but make it a thing to make these observations. Use it, have fun with it, and use it outside the retrospective. Start it in the retrospective, but continue it in your daily scrums. Have people make Hey Team observations. If you're the leader, model that behavior. Hey Team, I notice it. Get that to be a thing. Empower the team members to do that outside the retrospective. And then use the retrospective to consolidate the gains. How did we do? Ask some of those questions that I pointed out to you. How did we do? What do we want to focus on going forward? And that will help build your culture, and it will keep it going, and it will stop that mold from growing in between watering your plant, taking care of your team. And I throw this in here because a lot of things that you struggle with are symptoms that you need to focus on the culture. So when you try to change something and it doesn't stick, when the same problem comes up over and over, like, for example, that dysfunctional member, the energy that was created inside that person because they couldn't get the concern heard was what was causing the behavior. Telling the person to stop the behavior doesn't get rid of the energy. And so that behavior might stop, but the energy comes out someplace else. Okay, so you see the same problems coming up in different ways. Work is a drudge, it's not joyful. There's performance issues, people are slacking off. A lot of times we work with leadership teams, you see leaders spending their energy in their function rather than working together. That type of thing, you're always firefighting, no time, lots of stress, burnout. Those are all symptoms that maybe we should work on the culture. So just to sum up, don't fly blind. Create a map, whether it's the Inspired Teams map, whether it's a combination of that, whatever works for you. Be intentional about how you want to operate. Remember, everyone is responsible for the values, and it needs constant care. Use the Inspired Teams framework as your map, modify it, whatever. Use Hey Team or whatever feels comfortable for you, but something that's fun that encourages observations around what's going on in your culture. And finally, for your retrospectives, use the retrospective to get agreements on the values you want to live by. Use them to have a discussion of the value. How are you doing? What do we want to do differently? And then empower the team members. So use the "hey team" terminology in your retrospectives. Encourage that outside of the retrospective as well, but certainly use the retrospective to consolidate and your gains over the 2 weeks and move forward. So if you want more, I know that was a lot of information and I couldn't go really deeply into any of it. You can email me, steve@stephenwolff.com. And again, Comparative Agility website has the Inspired Teams framework. You can take a survey. Some of the terminology will be a little bit different, but it's basically the same.